He was chosen to execute a dangerous alien girl, but everything changed when their eyes met. The execution chamber was cold. Steel walls, sterile lighting, and the faint hum of machinery, everything about it screamed finality. Sergeant Marcus Blake stood at attention in front of the metal table, his pulse steady and his gaze locked onto the alien prisoner sitting before him. Her body was restrained by magnetic cuffs, her delicate green skin glistening under the harsh lights. She was a specimen of the Zalari, a race known across the galaxy for their strength, intelligence, and unmatched brutality. Her crime? Mass murder. The Zalari had been hunting humanity for years, raiding colonies and wiping out entire settlements. She was responsible for the destruction of Epsilon Station, where over 500 civilians had perished. Marcus had seen the footage. He'd watched as her eyes gleamed with cold malice as she led the charge. There was no mercy in her. She was a monster. Yet here she was, sitting before him, shackled and waiting for the execution order. Marcus was chosen for the task because of his unflinching resolve, his reputation as a soldier who never hesitated. The orders had been clear: execute her without hesitation. His mind was made up. He had no sympathy for the enemy, especially after all the death they had caused. The door behind him hissed open, and Commander Reynolds entered, his footsteps echoing across the metal floor. He stood beside Marcus, looking down at the prisoner with disdain. "You know what to do, Sergeant," Reynolds said, his voice low, almost clinical. "No mercy. The people demand justice." Marcus nodded, his hand hovering over the trigger. The device he held was a high-tech execution weapon, designed to end life in an instant. He glanced at the Zalari girl, her gaze shifting upward to meet his. And that's when everything changed. There was something in her eyes, something unexpected. It wasn't the coldness he had seen in the footage, nor the malice. It was sorrow. It was the kind of look that only someone who had known suffering could give. Her pupils widened as she locked eyes with him, as if she were trying to communicate something desperate. For a brief moment, Marcus faltered. "She's not like the others," he thought, but he quickly shoved that thought aside. She had killed innocent people. She had to be punished. There was no room for hesitation. The Zalari girl's lips parted, and she spoke in a voice that was surprisingly gentle. "You don't understand. We're not all the same." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" Her eyes never left his, and her voice grew softer. "I never wanted this. I was forced into it. My people, they're not what they seem. You're being lied to." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. It was the kind of plea he'd heard from the enemy before: desperation, manipulation. But there was something in her tone, in the way she carried herself, that made him question everything he thought he knew. Commander Reynolds shifted beside him, his impatience palpable. "Enough of this. Blake, do your job." Marcus clenched his jaw, but his hand still hovered over the execution device. He couldn't shake the doubt gnawing at him. Was she telling the truth? Could it be that humanity had been misled? Or was this just another trick to buy time? Another tactic from the enemy to escape her fate? He looked at her again, really looked at her. Her face was no longer the hardened, merciless expression of the footage. It was filled with pain, with a history he couldn't even begin to understand. She was young, barely more than a child in her species terms. How much of her life had been dictated by forces beyond her control? "Why should I believe you?" Marcus asked, his voice tight. "Because you're human," she whispered, "and you know what it means to fight for survival. We're not so different." The words echoed in his mind, and for the first time, Marcus wondered if his mission was as clear-cut as he had been led to believe. The conflict between his duty and the strange sympathy rising within him was overwhelming. Reynolds stepped forward, his hand on Marcus's shoulder, his voice a harsh whisper. "Blake, don't let her manipulate you. You've seen the evidence. She's a threat. She has to die." But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. The Zalari girl had said they weren't all the same, that they were being lied to. What if humanity's war against them was based on a lie? What if they were wrong? Without thinking, Marcus made his decision. He deactivated the execution device and stepped back, his mind made up. "I can't do this," he said quietly. "Not like this." Reynolds' face turned crimson with fury. "What are you talking about? You're disobeying orders. Blake, you will be court-martialed for this." "I'm not executing her," Marcus replied, his voice steady. Not until I know the truth. The room was silent for a moment, the tension thick in the air. The Zalari girl didn't say anything, but her eyes softened, gratitude flickering within them. She didn't seem surprised by his decision, maybe, just maybe, she had known all along that Marcus was different from the others. Reynolds stormed out, leaving Marcus alone with the prisoner. But Marcus didn't feel fear or guilt. He felt a strange sense of relief. He had made the right choice, and he was ready to face whatever consequences followed. The Zalari girl gave him one last look, one that spoke of trust, of understanding. It was then that Marcus realized she wasn't his enemy. Not anymore. Perhaps, together, they could find the truth. He was chosen to execute a dangerous alien girl, but everything changed when their eyes met. Part 2. Marcus hadn't anticipated that his decision would set off a chain of events that would ripple through the ranks of the military and across the galaxy. But as he stood there, facing the restrained alien, his mind raced. He had made a choice to question the narrative he had been fed for so long. And now, there was no turning back. The Zalari girl, no, she wasn't just a faceless enemy anymore, looked at him with a mix of gratitude and caution, her eyes gleaming with a light he hadn't expected. It was almost as if she were waiting for him to understand, to finally see the truth that had been hidden from them both. "What's your name?" Marcus asked, his voice rough. He was done with treating her like just another alien. If they were going to get to the bottom of this, they needed to start somewhere human. Her gaze shifted briefly, as if she were contemplating whether to reveal her name. "I'm Alira," she said softly, her voice almost like a whisper, laced with a quiet strength. "Why didn't you just fight back?" Marcus asked, his mind still tangled in the confusion of the past few minutes. She could have easily killed him or escaped. He knew the Zalari had powers that made them formidable enemies. Alira's gaze dropped for a moment, and then she met his eyes again, her expression hardening. "I've fought too many battles already. This isn't one I want to win. I'm not the monster they've painted me to be. I didn't ask for this war, but now it's too late to stop it." Marcus felt his chest tighten. Her words resonated with him in a way he couldn't fully comprehend. He'd grown up in a world where survival was the ultimate priority, where the enemy was always a threat that needed to be neutralized. No questions asked. But now, standing here, it was clear that things were far more complicated. Before he could respond, the door hissed open again, and Commander Reynolds stormed in, his face flushed with fury. "Blake, what the hell is going on here?" he barked, his voice echoing in the sterile chamber. Marcus didn't flinch, but Alira's shoulders stiffened at the sound of Reynolds' voice. "I'm not executing her, sir," Marcus said firmly, his eyes never leaving the commander's. "Not until we know the truth." Reynolds' face twisted in disbelief. "The truth? Are you out of your mind? She's a war criminal, a threat to humanity, and you're standing here talking about the truth? You are a soldier, Blake. You follow orders, that's what you do." "I'm still a human, Reynolds," Marcus shot back, "and I'm not going to blindly follow orders that could be based on a lie." Alira's eyes flickered toward Marcus, a silent appreciation in her gaze. But Reynolds wasn't done yet. He stepped forward, his fist slamming down onto the table, his voice low and dangerous. "You're making a mistake, Blake. You don't understand the stakes. If you let her live, if you show even the slightest hint of weakness, you put all of us at risk. This could mean the end of everything we've fought for." Marcus' heart pounded in his chest. He knew Reynolds was right about one thing: the stakes were high. The Zalari had already caused untold destruction. But was this really the only way forward? Was he really willing to turn his back on the truth simply because it was easier to cling to the enemy image that had been burned into his mind for so long? "I'm not saying I trust her yet," Marcus said slowly, his voice steady, "but I'm not going to kill her without understanding what's going on. There's more to this war than we've been told. I can feel it." Reynolds' face hardened. For a long moment, the two men locked eyes, and Marcus could almost feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He knew Reynolds wasn't going to let this go easily, but he also knew that he couldn't live with himself if he gave in. "You're making a grave mistake, Blake," Reynolds muttered, stepping back. "I hope you know what you're doing." With that, the commander stormed out of the room, leaving Marcus and Alira in uneasy silence. Marcus let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. his eyes never leaving the alien girl in front of him. He didn't know where this path would lead. He didn't know if he could trust her, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he was actually doing what was right, not just what was ordered. I don't know what happens next, he said quietly, more to himself than to her, but I'm going to find out. For both of us. Elira nodded, her expression somber but resolute. I hope you're ready. Marcus, the truth isn't something anyone wants to face, but once you see it, you can never go back. Marcus took a deep breath and glanced at the door, knowing that the forces aligned against him were already mobilizing. Reynolds would not let this go, and the military would soon be in full force to ensure that Elira was executed. But he also knew that if he didn't act now, they might never get the chance to uncover the truth. There's a lot I need to understand, Marcus said, turning back to Elira, but I'll do what it takes to get it. With that, he made up his mind. He wasn't going to just stand by and watch history repeat itself. The war, the bloodshed, the propaganda, it all had to end. For better or for worse, Marcus Blake had taken his first step into unknown territory. And there was no turning back now. He was chosen to execute a dangerous alien girl, but everything changed when their eyes met. Part 3. The next few hours were a blur of decisions Marcus hadn't expected to make. Once Reynolds left, the room fell into an uneasy silence. Marcus paced back and forth, trying to clear his thoughts. He had made a choice, but now he was realizing how much more complicated everything was. Elira was still sitting at the table, calm despite the tension. She hadn't spoken a word since their exchange with Reynolds. Her eyes followed Marcus's movements, as if waiting for him to come to a decision that would change everything. Do you have a plan? She asked suddenly, her voice low but steady. Marcus stopped pacing, feeling the weight of her question. A plan? He had no idea what the hell he was doing. He was just acting on instinct now, on a gut feeling that maybe, just maybe, there was more to this war than anyone had told him. I'm trying to figure that out, he admitted, running a hand through his hair. I don't even know where to start. Elira's lips parted as though she wanted to speak, but then she hesitated. After a long pause, she spoke again, her voice tinged with something like regret. The Zalari. We weren't always like this. I can tell you the truth, Marcus, but the question is, will you believe me? Marcus stood still, the weight of her words settling on him. He wanted to believe her. The doubt that had crept into his mind after their first conversation had only grown stronger with each passing minute. But could he trust her? Really? She was still the enemy, wasn't she? You're asking me to trust you when you've done terrible things, Marcus said, trying to keep his voice neutral. You're not exactly giving me a lot to go on. I know, Elira replied, her eyes flickering with something like sorrow. I don't expect you to trust me immediately, but I'm offering you something you'll never get from the commanders. The truth. Marcus sighed, running his fingers through his hair again. The whole situation was too big, too complex. If he listened to her, he might be condemning humanity to even more devastation. If he didn't, he might be perpetuating a cycle of hatred that had no end. But in his gut, he knew that this moment right here, was different from anything he had ever faced before. The war had always been black and white, humanity against the Zalari. But Elira was making him see that it wasn't that simple. He crossed his arms and met her gaze. All right, tell me everything. For a long time, Elira didn't speak. She just sat there, as though choosing her words carefully. Finally, she took a deep breath. I wasn't part of the raids that killed your people, she began slowly, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. I wasn't even supposed to be a soldier. I was a civilian, a worker on one of our home planets. But when the war started, everything changed. The Zalari leadership, they took everything from us. They conscripted everyone, forced us to fight. Marcus listened intently, though every fiber of his being screamed that this was a trap. She was the enemy, after all. But something in her tone made him listen, made him hold off on his judgment for just a little longer. Your commanders told you that we're a race of conquerors, Elira continued, her voice filled with a quiet rage, that we're bent on destroying humanity. That's what we were taught too. But there's a faction within the Zalari who want peace. There always has been. The war you're fighting isn't just about survival. It's about control. It's about power. And it's all been manipulated by a few who see humanity as an obstacle. Marcus frowned, trying to process her words. So you're telling me that this entire war has been engineered by a small group of powerful individuals within your species? That we're not actually fighting an enemy, just a few corrupt leaders pulling the strings? Elira nodded. That's exactly it. The truth is, Marcus's humanity was never meant to be our enemy. We were both pawns in a game. But your people, you've been made to believe that we're monsters. You've been taught to hate us, and now, your commanders want to ensure that we continue fighting so they can keep control over your people. The war's not about survival anymore. It's about domination. Marcus felt like the ground was shifting beneath him. His entire worldview, the principles he had fought for, the things he had been taught to believe, were crumbling before his eyes. He was starting to see the pieces of the puzzle, but they didn't fit together in the way he had always assumed. I need proof, Marcus said, struggling to find his bearings. I can't just take your word for it. I need to know this is real. Elira's eyes darkened with something deeper, something that spoke of painful knowledge. You want proof? Then you'll have to come with me. There's a hidden base, a safe house for those of us who don't want to fight. If you want to know the truth, you'll have to see it for yourself. Marcus hesitated, the weight of her words pressing heavily on him. She wanted him to risk everything, his career, his life, his loyalty, to go behind enemy lines. But in the pit of his stomach, something told him that this was the only way to uncover what was really happening in this war. Fine, Marcus said, his voice firm. Take me there. Elira's eyes flickered with something like relief, though it was quickly masked by her usual calm demeanor. It won't be easy. They'll come for us the moment they realize you're gone. But if you truly want to understand, this is your only chance. Marcus took a deep breath, his mind racing. If what Elira said was true, he was walking into a world of secrets and lies, secrets that could tear apart everything he had believed in. But he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in his gut that told him this was the right thing to do. This is the only chance we get, Marcus said, his voice low, resolute. We're in this together now. Elira met his gaze, and for the first time since their encounter, Marcus saw something like trust in her eyes. She nodded once, and with that, their dangerous journey into the heart of the war began. There was no turning back now. He was chosen to execute a dangerous alien girl, but everything changed when their eyes met. Part 4. The decision had been made. Marcus was no longer just a soldier following orders. Now, he was a participant in something far greater, something he couldn't yet fully comprehend. He had chosen to believe in Elira's words, to risk everything on the hope that the truth would be more than the lie he had been fed for his entire life. They moved quickly after that. Marcus had to act fast before Reynolds realized what had happened, before the military turned on him completely. Elira, despite being in chains, was surprisingly agile and calm as she guided him through the hidden corridors of the facility. Her every move was deliberate, calculated. Marcus could tell she had done this before. As they reached the facility's lower levels, Elira turned to him and whispered, "There's a hidden transport bay. It's not on the security grid. It's our only way out." Marcus's eyes scanned the area. The walls were bare, unmarked. Everything was pristine, as though nothing lived here except for the cold machinery. "I'm trusting you, Elira," Marcus said, his voice low. He still had doubts, still had questions that gnawed at him, but there was no time to linger on them now. "I'm trusting you too, Marcus," she replied. There was no hesitation in her voice. That, more than anything, gave him pause. She wasn't just some alien prisoner anymore. She was someone who was risking everything on a chance that might very well lead to their deaths. They reached the transport bay. It was a small, concealed area filled with a few military-grade shuttles. Most of the ships were designed for the covert transport of soldiers and cargo, but Marcus could tell from the way Elira was scanning the area that one of them was not meant for human eyes. Elira's hand hovered over a control panel, and with a quiet beep, the door to one of the shuttles slid open. "It's not much, but it'll get us there," Elira said, stepping inside. Marcus hesitated for a moment. His heart was racing. He was leaving behind everything he knew, his rank, his career, and even the military code that had been his entire life. He was about to abandon everything for a cause that felt more uncertain with each passing second. But when he looked at Elira, her eyes steady, filled with a quiet resolve, he knew he couldn't back out. Not now. Not when he had come this far. He followed her inside, sealing the hatch behind him. The small shuttle hummed to life, the artificial gravity kicking in as they lifted off the ground. The narrow cockpit was quiet except for the faint hum of the engine and the soft beeping of the controls. Marcus leaned back in his seat, trying to steady his breathing. "Where exactly are we going?" Marcus asked. "To the hidden base," Elira replied, her fingers deftly navigating the controls. "It's not far from here, but they'll be looking for us soon. The moment they realize I've escaped, they'll send a team after us. We have to move fast." Marcus nodded, glancing out of the viewport. The stars outside were a comforting sight, far more peaceful than the chaos unfolding inside the walls of the military facility. But that calmness was an illusion. He knew better than anyone that the galaxy was full of dangers, full of forces ready to tear everything apart if they weren't stopped. "How do you know this base exists?" Marcus asked, trying to steer the conversation back to the truth Elira had promised. "I used to be part of it," she said softly, her eyes distant as she stared at the controls. "I wasn't always the soldier they forced me to become. I had family there, people who believed in peace. But the Zalari leadership betrayed us all. They forced us to fight, to kill. Those of us who refused became outcasts, but some of us kept fighting for the truth." Marcus absorbed her words, his mind churning with questions. How much of her story was real? How much of it was manipulation? But even as those questions formed, he realized that he couldn't keep doubting her. He had already made the choice to trust her, now he had to follow through. For better or for worse. Minutes passed in silence as Elira piloted the shuttle toward its destination. Marcus's eyes kept drifting toward the distant stars, lost in thought. How much of this war was fabricated? How many lives had been lost because of a lie? He wanted to know the truth, needed to know the truth. But he also knew that truth could be a dangerous thing. "What happens if we find this base?" Marcus asked, finally breaking the silence. "What do we do then?" "We confront the leadership," Elira replied simply. "We expose the truth to both sides, the Zalari and the humans. If we can stop the war, stop the lies, we might have a chance at peace." Marcus blinked. "And you think we can just waltz into the heart of the Zalari's power and expose all of this? Just like that?" Elira's gaze met his, and for the first time, he saw something else in her eyes. Not just determination, but a flicker of hope. "We have no choice. If we don't do this, it's over. All of it. The war, the bloodshed, it'll never stop." Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words. What she was asking was monumental. It wasn't just about saving lives or stopping a war. It was about changing the course of history. Could they really do that? "All right," Marcus said, his voice low but resolute. "Let's do it." The shuttle continued its journey into the unknown, and with each passing second, Marcus felt the world he once knew slipping further away. There would be no going back. But as he looked at Elira once more, something inside him stirred, a strange feeling. Something like hope, but far more dangerous. They were no longer enemies. They were allies now, bound by a cause bigger than both of them. And in that moment, Marcus realized that the true war was not between species, but between those who sought the truth and those who hid it. The shuttle veered toward the edge of known space, where the truth was waiting. And Marcus Blake was ready to face it. He was chosen to execute a dangerous alien girl, but everything changed when their eyes met. Part 5. The journey felt like an eternity. The shuttle hummed steadily through the void of space, its small frame cutting through the darkness like a whisper. Marcus sat in the cockpit beside Elira, his fingers tapping nervously against the edge of his seat. He tried to focus on the stars outside, the cold, unfeeling expanse that seemed to stretch on forever, but his thoughts kept drifting back to what was happening below. The war, the lies, the power behind it all. He knew they were heading to a base, an underground haven where those who had once fought for peace were now hiding from both the Zalari leadership and the human military. It was their last hope, a place that Elira had once called home, a place she was now leading Marcus to in the hopes of exposing the truth, stopping the war that had torn both species apart. "How long until we arrive?" Marcus asked, breaking the silence. "Not long," Elira replied, her voice steady as she navigated the shuttle with practiced ease. Her eyes remained fixed on the controls, but there was a flicker of unease in her expression. "They'll be expecting us soon. Once we cross into this sector, They'll track our shuttle's signature. We need to make it there before that happens. Marcus's heart picked up speed. The thought of being hunted, of being pursued by forces from both sides, made the air feel thick and oppressive. But despite the rising tension in his chest, he trusted Alira. If they had any chance of succeeding, it was because they were in this together, and together, they had to keep moving forward. I don't want to lose you, Marcus said quietly, his voice rough. The words were out before he could stop them. A brief moment of vulnerability slipping through his tough exterior. He glanced at her, hoping she hadn't noticed the quiet intensity in his voice. Alira didn't look up immediately, but her lips curled into the faintest of smiles. You won't. Her response gave him a sense of clarity that he hadn't expected. She wasn't just the alien prisoner anymore. She wasn't just a potential ally in a war of survival. She was someone who had given up everything for the chance at peace. Someone who was willing to risk everything for something that might not even work. He could see it now. He could see how the war had turned her into something she wasn't. A weapon, a tool, a pawn in someone else's game, just like him. Minutes passed, the silence between them growing heavier as the stars outside began to stretch and warp, signaling their entry into a new sector of space. The calm, mechanical hum of the shuttle did little to ease the rising tension in Marcus's chest. The truth was waiting for them, but there was no guarantee it would set them free. We're close, Alira said suddenly, her voice breaking the stillness. Prepare yourself. Once we land, we have to move quickly. Marcus nodded, checking his weapons, ensuring his sidearm was secured and his gear was in place. The thought of confronting the leaders of the Zalari, a group that had orchestrated this entire conflict, sent a jolt of adrenaline through his veins. The shuttle dropped lower through the atmosphere of a barren planet, the rocky surface coming into view. In the distance, a concealed base sat hidden beneath the jagged peaks of a mountain range, the harsh terrain providing an ideal camouflage. This is it, Alira said, her fingers dancing across the control panel as she slowed the shuttle's descent. Get ready. It won't be easy from here. Marcus's hand tightened around his weapon, and his heart raced in anticipation. The moment they landed, they would be in enemy territory. They would have no backup, no reinforcements. It was just him, Alira, and the truth they hoped to uncover. As the shuttle's landing gear touched down with a soft thud, Alira powered down the systems. They were in. The base loomed ahead, a series of heavily guarded buildings and tunnels that stretched deep into the planet's crust. We need to make it to the main command center, Alira whispered, her eyes scanning the surroundings. That's where the core data is. The records, the communications, everything that proves what really happened. Once we get there, we can expose the truth. Marcus nodded. Lead the way. They exited the shuttle, weapons ready. The harsh winds of the barren planet whipped through the air, but the base provided cover, its thick walls shielding them from the elements. They moved quickly, their footsteps muffled by the dust and stone underfoot. The base was eerily quiet. The usual sounds of activity, guards patrolling, machinery humming, communication signals buzzing, were absent. It was as though the place was abandoned, as if everyone was waiting for something, or someone. Alira, something doesn't feel right, Marcus muttered, his instincts screaming at him. Alira stopped in her tracks, her body tensing as she listened. You're right, she said softly. They've been expecting us. Before Marcus could react, the ground trembled beneath their feet, and a deep, guttural hum vibrated through the walls. Then, suddenly, the silence was shattered by the sound of heavy doors sliding open, followed by the sharp crackle of static-filled comms. Alira, a voice boomed over the intercom. We've been watching you. You've walked right into our trap. Marcus's blood ran cold. His hand instinctively went to his sidearm as the voice continued. You think you can expose the truth? You think you can stop this war? You're fools, all of you. Alira's face hardened, and for the first time, Marcus saw a flash of something deeper in her eyes, something more terrifying than fear. It was the look of someone who had been betrayed, someone who had known this moment was coming. Alira, what's going on? Marcus asked, his voice tense. They know we're here, she said, her voice tight with a barely contained fury. It's not just about exposing the truth. They'll do whatever it takes to silence us. And if they can't silence us, they'll destroy us. A series of heavy footsteps echoed down the hall toward them, and Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. It was too late to turn back. Whatever was about to happen would change everything. And it would happen now. Marcus and Alira backed into a corner, their weapons drawn, ready for what was coming next. The base was no longer a sanctuary, it was a battleground. And the war they had once known had only just begun. He was chosen to execute a dangerous alien girl, but everything changed when their eyes met. Part 6. The footsteps grew louder, and Marcus's senses heightened. His pulse raced, his grip on his sidearm tightening as the metallic clank of boots against the stone floors echoed through the dimly lit hallways. It was clear now, they were walking straight into a trap, and Alira's expression, normally so controlled, betrayed the fear and resolve she was trying to suppress. "Stay sharp," Marcus whispered, his voice low but firm. Alira nodded, her fingers brushing the edge of a concealed panel on the wall. She seemed to hesitate for a split second, then pressed a sequence of buttons with precision, as if she had anticipated this moment. The door in front of them clicked open with a soft hiss, revealing a narrow passage that led deeper into the base. "Through here," she said urgently, grabbing Marcus's arm. "It's a maintenance tunnel. We can avoid most of the security this way." Without waiting for confirmation, she pulled him forward, and they darted into the shadows, the door sliding shut behind them with a soft thud. They moved quickly, navigating the labyrinth of tunnels beneath the base. The faint hum of the facility above them was muffled, but the sound of distant shouting and alarms reached their ears, telling them just how close they were to being caught. Marcus could feel the weight of every moment pressing on him, the sensation of being hunted, of knowing that they were racing against forces far bigger than themselves. "This way," Alira whispered, leading him through another series of turns. Her eyes were sharp, focused. She knew this place like the back of her hand, and Marcus was beginning to understand that it wasn't just her survival instincts at play. It was her knowledge of the Zalari's operations, knowledge she had once been part of. As they reached a dead-end corridor, Alira slid her hand over another control panel, revealing a hidden hatch in the floor. "Down there. It'll lead us to the command center," she said, her voice strained with urgency. They descended quickly into the darkness below, the air growing colder and heavier as they moved deeper into the complex. The tunnel was cramped, but they had no choice but to push on. Every minute that passed made it more likely that the facility's security would catch up with them. "What happens when we get to the command center?" Marcus asked, breathless. "How do we expose everything? What if they have everything locked down already?" "We'll get access to the central database," Alira answered. "We'll show the data to both sides, prove the truth. The Zalari military isn't one unified force. There are factions within it, ones that are fighting for power and control. They've manipulated this war to serve their own interests, not to protect their people." Marcus's mind whirled at her words. The truth she was offering was more dangerous than anything he had imagined. If they could really expose the corruption, the lies, how many lives would be affected? How many people would turn against the very system that had defined their lives for so long? Alira stopped abruptly, holding up a hand. Marcus froze beside her. Ahead, a faint light spilled into the hallway from a nearby doorway. Through the cracks in the door, Marcus could hear voices. "They're closing in," Alira murmured. "Stay quiet." They pressed themselves into the shadows, barely breathing as the voices grew louder. There were soldiers just beyond the door, 2 or 3 of them, judging by the murmurs. Marcus could feel his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. There would be no more time for second guesses. If they were caught now, everything would fall apart. "Are you ready?" Alira whispered. He didn't answer right away. His mind was still racing, unsure of what was about to happen. But he knew that he had come too far to back down now. And with that, he nodded once, a silent promise to himself and to Alira. The voices outside grew fainter as the soldiers moved further down the hall. Alira didn't waste a second. She signaled for Marcus to follow, and they slipped through the door, into the narrow, dimly lit corridor beyond. They continued forward, their steps quiet and deliberate. As they neared the end of the hallway, Alira gestured for Marcus to stop. There, ahead of them, was a large security door, more heavily fortified than anything they had seen so far. It was their final obstacle before they could reach the command center. Alira turned to Marcus, her eyes narrowing. "This is it. If we can hack into this system, we'll have access to everything, the records, the communications, the names of those behind this war. But we don't have long." Once we activate the system, they'll know we're here. So we have one shot at this. Marcus's jaw tightened as he took a deep breath, his mind focusing entirely on the task at hand. No more second-guessing, no more doubts. Let's make it count, he said. Alira didn't hesitate. She moved to the panel beside the door, her fingers flying across the surface, entering a complex series of commands. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours as Marcus stood guard, every muscle tense, every nerve alert to the smallest sound. Suddenly, the door hissed and clicked open. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. They were in. Go, Alira urged, her voice barely above a whisper. We have to get to the main terminal. They moved swiftly into the command center, a massive room filled with rows of consoles and monitors, the flickering lights casting an eerie glow over the space. Alira wasted no time, heading straight for the central terminal, her hands flying over the controls. Marcus stayed on high alert, his weapon raised, scanning the room for any movement. His mind was racing, trying to prepare for the inevitable response from the base's security. And then, the terminal chimed. The screen flickered and then came to life, the data cascading in front of them. Alira quickly pulled up a series of encrypted files, her eyes scanning the information with practiced precision. She selected a few key files, and Marcus's stomach churned as he saw the details. These were the reports that could change everything, the evidence of corruption, of manipulation, of the war being orchestrated by a few powerful figures within the Zalari leadership. It wasn't just a war, it was a business, a means to amass power and control. Marcus, Alira said, her voice tight, we have what we need, but we have to send this to the human fleet, now. Marcus glanced back at the terminal, then at the door. The sound of boots echoed from the hallway. They were coming. He didn't hesitate. Do it. I'll cover you. Alira nodded quickly, activating the transmission system. The data began to send, a small progress bar ticking forward. Seconds felt like hours as Marcus's eyes remained glued to the hallway, watching for the first signs of their enemies. The transmission finished just as the door slid open, a squad of armed soldiers pouring in. We've got company, Marcus shouted. The final confrontation had begun.